Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Suzie Lewis. So, Suzie, can I call you up to the stage?
Hi.
Hi, Suzie. As I mentioned in my introduction, Suzie is joining us from Toulouse in France. She's the founder and MD of Transform for Value, creating sustainable transformation. And we were chatting earlier and you were telling me, Suzie, that you've been working in this field for over 20 years, and it was actually moving to live in France and seeing how different cultures operate that made you really interested in transformation. And I think your focus for us today is really on the human side of transformation. We all talk about change management, digital transformation, digital change, but at the heart of it all are people. So thank you very much for joining us. Really looking forward to hearing from you. Suzie has said, as Mike said, that if you do want to ask a question, if you've got a burning question during her talk, please post it in the chat and I'll pick it up and interrupt Suzie. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for some networking and questions. So many thanks for joining us, Suzie, and over to you now.
You're welcome. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for welcoming me on the platform. It's a first for me in terms of the Remo software, using it like this, which means that when I'm presenting, because I do have some slides to show you and some visuals, I won't be able to see myself. So I will be talking about moving out of your comfort zone. So that's me being a guinea pig as well and practicing what I preach. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I live in France and I worked in a large organization for 20 years, always looking at transformation, but I started on the supply chain as a lean expert, looking at value and logistic flows and what that means for the way production lines run, but also very quickly I came to what does it mean for people and how are people needing to manage differently and look at the value they create differently. I moved into HR. I spent 10 years in HR looking at transformation and change. I did operational HR. I did recruitment. I did diversity and inclusion. I also we set up the leadership university for the whole of the organization that I worked for. So we looked at the new paradigms of leadership. And then I also moved into the digital transformation office, where we looked not only at digital and data and technology, but particularly at people, because for me, digital transformation is 80% about people. And I then left the organization I was in and set up my own business, basically to help organizations, big and small, startups, governmental institutions, public institutions, large organizations, understand human systems to allow for sustainable transformation. So really looking at the simple things of how do I create awareness, how do I create understanding, and how do we move to a more sustainable change. So my passion is for collective intelligence and unlocking potential. I'm also a cellist in an orchestra. I have been for 30 odd years, and that is also an example for me of how we can create sustainable and collective vision and purpose. I'll come to it in my presentation. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to put some visuals on the screen, and please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. Okay, so sustainable transformation. For me, this is the topic that is becoming more and more topical. How do we bridge the gap between digital and human? And I chose this picture on purpose because it really is about that. It's about technology getting more human, and therefore what keeps us human, and how can we keep what we need from the human being: imagination, creativity, the ability of dreaming. How can we keep that, but yet use what digital will enable for us? So I wanted to start with Pepper, and Pepper and I have quite a good relationship. So in the last team where I worked, we had a Pepper robot, and we discussed quite a lot about whether it's a he or a she, and we decided it was a she because we gave it some emotional intelligence, and we programmed it. And I would walk into the office every morning and say, "Hi, Pepper," and I would stroke her head, and she would answer, "I like that," or "that tickles." And sometimes she would answer, "I feel like a cat," which brought me back down to earth, and I thought, okay, that it's a robot. However, one of my colleagues said to me quite quickly, Sue, stop talking to this robot as if it was a human being. It's a robot. And I think at that point, I thought, okay, this is a borderline between digital and human. So why was I treating Pepper as a robot? Because she was answering an inherent human need I had for connection and warmth and creating a relationship. And so I started thinking about, okay, what does that boundary look like? And how can I use that to sort of help people understand what I'm looking for from a human perspective? And there's only so much that we can program into robots currently via AI, via robotics, via all types of software that can mean that they can interact with humans. And particularly with COVID, I think the idea of connection and warmth is something we're all lacking. And, you know, with the third lockdown, and they're looking at, you know, we're looking at building our resilience, and we've adapted to that change. But how sustainable is that adaptation? So that was my Pepper experience. And it was also my thought process on, okay, how can we bring these two worlds together, whether you're in a governmental institution, an organization, a startup, or a community, because tech is so present, everybody is constantly needing to think about, okay, we're going to work differently. How can I bridge that gap between what humans need and how they would like to interact and what tech brings to them? I mean, for me, the speed of tech is just mind blowing. So this is just an example of a minute on the internet in 2020. How many Instagram stories, how many Zoom meetings, and particularly with Zoom and COVID, you know, how many podcasts, how many hours of video are uploaded. And when you look at the speed of tech, you've got these two things that are at the extremes of a scale for me, which is the speed, the exponential speed of tech change, and the human reaction to change, which of course is a lot slower. But what COVID has accelerated is both of those. So it's accelerated the speed of tech change, which was already exponential, and it's also accelerating the need for us to manage our reactions to change. I love this picture for lots of reasons, partly because for me it's reality today. It's reality because this is where we all have to work. We're all working virtually, and that doesn't mean we're not connected. So when I look at the screen and I look at the different expressions, they are connected, and there is some human connection. But this type of virtual connection can become transactional so quickly, as I'm sure you've experienced. You know, when you only have the screen, how can you make it human? How can you really create that connection that humans are wired for and create belonging? So it reminds me of Zoom, but I like the fact that there are three human beings sitting on a bench watching this screen, because it is also about how do you create the human connection. And it reminds me of an anecdote of one of my best friend's weddings, where I remember walking into the wedding, I hardly knew anyone, and looking at this sea of faces, and she rang me the next day and thanked me personally for speaking to absolutely everyone. And I was thinking, did I? And she said, yeah, you did. And I thought, wow, that's really impressive. But basically, it was just indicative of my passion for people, but also the need for human connection. So there are limits to what we can do with Zoom, but at least it allows us to connect on a certain level. Cognitively, yes, emotionally a little bit, but where does this reality take us? There are three shifts that I want to discuss with you that for me underpin the understanding of bridging this gap between digital and human. So ego to eco is the first shift, and that's another reason why I love the picture we've just seen. So it's the shift from I to we. And it's a shift that's happening all over the world because the world is becoming more and more interconnected. But if I bring it down to working in a team or an organization, it is that constant battle between the individual take on things and the collective take on things. So in an organization, it's clearly things like performance management. We have individual objectives. We're rated on our individual performance, but yet we want to be more collective, and we want to have more collective objectives. If I look at any relationship, you're constantly thinking, it's this constant balance between how much time should I be spending for me and how much time should I be spending for my partner, my family, my community, my organization, my team. So this shift from I to we is massive and is becoming more and more present. And we as humans need to understand what that means for the way we behave. And if I look at the eco part of it, the interconnectedness of the mutual support that comes from building communities, the idea of working together in collective intelligence, the impact you can have is huge from mutual support groups or communities of practice that allow essentially a space to be created where people can co-create, but also bring their perspectives to the table and create something that is probably richer than if I just worked on my own, but it takes longer and it requires different skills, interpersonal skills. So ego to eco for me is a big shift that is happening all the time, particularly in leadership. And then we come to Einstein, and it's about different thinking. So digital enablement is forcing us to think differently, and we have to think differently, and our habits are changing massively. So this is all the things around design thinking, agile methodology, new methods that are coming up that help us to think differently, but they're basically helping us to step out of our comfort zone and go back to the creativity we had when we were a child, before we were formatted by the world of work and the world of education. So if I look at the Industrial Revolution, where there was a particular paradigm in place in terms of 9-to-5 working, a very task-oriented, let's say, paradigm of leadership, and that people were there to deliver, and they did that, and then they went home and did something else. And those boundaries were a lot clearer than they are today. So we need to start thinking differently. And when people talk, using both sides of our brain. So when I hear, I need to think about the way I feel, I think we need to start feeling about the way we think. And this is really about taking a step back and thinking, okay, how do we do this differently? Particularly in digital transformation, because you have the area of digital tools where it's about learning, and then you have what they enable. And that is going to require us to take a step back and look at what the ecosystem looks like and what we can do with it. Which brings me to, I don't know how many of you are Star Wars fans. I am. It brings me to Master Yoda. So unlearn you must, if I use my Yoda language. But this for me is the third trend. So we've looked at the shift from I to we and from individual to collective. We've looked at the need to think differently. And also, and when I say think differently, I also mean question our existing paradigms, so stepping out of that's the way we do it today. Can we do it differently? And then learning, unlearning, and relearning is one of the biggest challenges globally that digital transformation enables, but also poses. I mean, just look at the way we bank today. When was the last time any one of you walked into the bank? I can't remember the last time I walked into a bank, but I don't need to. I don't need to because I have everything at my fingertips. Or even when I moved out of the organization and into entrepreneurship, that was so different. I had to unlearn almost everything that I'd learned about ways of working and relearn how to do it differently. I didn't have an IT department anymore that would help me. I didn't have a procurement department anymore that would help me. I didn't use the same tools. I didn't know half of the platforms that existed. So, learning, unlearning, and relearning is very uncomfortable, but it's an absolute necessity. And we just need to get comfortable with that in the same way that, and we've seen how adaptable we are as human beings. I mean, COVID is the biggest imposed learning by doing experiment ever. And we've managed, but my question is it sustainable? And therefore, do we understand how we've managed what COVID has imposed on us? So this learning, unlearning, relearning is so difficult for us because our brains are not wired like that. They're wired for certainty, routine. And I like to say, in terms of understanding change, it's about this scenario, which I'm sure is familiar to everyone. You know, you get this massive, let's take digital transformation. So when we got our first digital transformation project, where I used to work, it was like, oh yeah, this is going to be so cool. We're going to do this. Who wants change? Everyone's like, yeah, me. Okay, let's go down a level. Who wants to change? A little less enthusiasm. And then the killer question, who wants to lead the change? It's like, oh, that's just me then. And this is why leadership is often a lonely place, but particularly in terms of leading change, because it's so uncomfortable, and it does mean stepping out of your comfort zone. It does mean questioning how you think, and it does mean taking risks and putting yourself into a zone of vulnerability that you need to manage differently. So, for example, when I set up the Leadership University, we decided we would practice what we preach, which is very important for me in terms of operational credibility. And we wanted a flatter way of working in terms of ecosystems and hierarchy. So we changed the title of everyone to exactly the same title. And it was very interesting to see how people reacted to that and what type of atmosphere it brought in the team. And it was a pilot. We were just testing it. And it wasn't without its ups and downs. And when I left and I changed jobs and I went into digital transformation, they went immediately back and reverted to what was there before. And my thinking on that wasn't like, oh, how could they do that? It was, okay, one, I obviously didn't convince enough. Two, it was obviously a change that was being led by a change leader, myself, who had a vision and wholly believed in it. But I hadn't taken the people with me enough on that. And so they just went back to their comfort zone. And it's very interesting because our brains are wired for change in a certain way. And I wanted to share this this model with you because I think it is about your scarf, and it's about how you're wearing it and how you feel with your scarf. So this model comes from David Rock from it's Neuro Leadership Institute, and it's the 5 biggest threats to our brain that takes it into fight or flight mode. So you have status, so our relative importance to others. So typically, in the example I've just given, if you flatten titles, you're changing somebody's status in the organization. Okay, so that creates an alarm bell in the brain. Certainty, so being able to predict the future, and also autonomy, being able to control events. Okay, and that famous saying of you can't control what other people say and do, but you can control your reaction to it. And that feeling of autonomy and having control over what's going on is very important for our brains. That's how they're wired, to feel okay. Relatedness and a sense of connection. So this is why I liked Pepper so much, but it wasn't enough. You know, we need to feel that we belong to a tribe or a group or a community. And fairness, so a perception of whether things are fair or not. And we were working with a group of leaders over COVID, and we ended up having a joke on, oh yeah, everybody has a problem with their car in COVID, which is true. Nothing is certain. You don't feel like you have control over events, and you feel disconnected. So understanding this model, and I've used it with a lot of teams because it's individual, but then it also helps you understand your own reactions. And therefore you can, once you have understood how you react, or should I say which scarf you're wearing, then you can help others also understand where they are and how they can help themselves with that. Which brings me on to 2 distinctions if I go a level down from change. So this is how every human reacts to change, but then you have these distinctions that Robert Keegan makes around the 2 different parts of change. So you have technical challenges and adaptive challenges. And technical challenges are anything to do with process, governance, systems. And then you have adaptive challenges, which are, as you can see, about the heart and the brain, basically about behaviors, mindsets, and how you think. And the biggest waste of resource today in digital transformation is solving adaptive problems with technical solutions. So if I look at digital transformation, often we look at the technical challenges. So we look at IT legacy systems, we look at what needs to be done, we look at what skills we need to bring on board. Is it cloud? Is it AI? Is it robotics? How does that change the governance? But what about the human legacy systems? What about the ways people have been working to date, the way they feel about what they do, whether they feel they control their environment, whether they feel autonomous in their environment? So all these different things come and allow us to look at a roadmap for change. So not only the technical roadmap, and I'm not saying the technical roadmap isn't necessary and isn't difficult and isn't complex, it can be, particularly IT legacy systems. But I'm now thinking of, what if we had a sandwich and in parallel you had the human dimension? So what do we need to do to onboard people and to take them on a journey? They need to understand the technical challenges clearly, but they also need to understand where they need to adapt. So where they need to change their behavior, their mindset, and their ways of working. And of course, that happens at very, very different speeds. Which brings me back to this picture. It's all about people. I mean, if I go back to the technical and adaptive challenges and the trends of today around how we deal with digital transformation and how we put innovation and different ways of thinking into communities, organizations, and ways of working, it's very often around the people. So let me give you an example of when I was working in France with the public sector, and they had decided that they wanted to dematerialize everything and put everything on a platform. And they wanted to just pour, in inverted commas, everything they had into HTML on a platform. And then they were going to tick a box and say they'd gone digital. And we had a large discussion about how we could accompany that process and also weave the human dimension into that. And it was massively successful and exceedingly interesting because we took lean methodology, so mapping out the value, which of those tasks done today are value added, which are non-value added, where can we save time and resource and headspace. And then we also took a more human-centered UX type of design and said, let's get the customers into the room at the same time for these workshops. And let's try and understand and empathize with what they need and how they feel and how they think about this process. And it was very successful because at the same time, we also had the people who were technically doing the process behind there as well. So that diversity of perspective was huge. And it's essentially bringing me to the discussion around user experience. So what is digital? Is digital being online 24/7? Is digital putting everything on a platform? Is digital understanding data and understanding how to code and being able to say we have a center of data analytics, a data analyst, sorry, so we know how to get insights from data? My answer to that is it's all that and more. And it's really about understanding what and where you need to transform digitally. What can digital enable for you in terms of data, in terms of software, in terms of systems? And then the user experience. What type of experience are you trying to create? Is the first part of that experience. And the second part of that experience is what type of conditions and environment do you need to create where you're working within your team or community to actually allow people to move into that adaptive challenge phase where they are willing to look at how they work and to collectively discuss how can we change the way we think and feel about this. Which brings me to readiness. So you need to take people on a journey. And throughout my years of transformation experience and then the digital experience that came on top of that, and of course, setting up the Leadership University, where you're really looking at neuroscience, people, leadership skills, and collective intelligence. So how do these things happen? And I come back to the beginning of the presentation. The speed of tech is just mind-blowing for me. And I'm not a digital native, and I've had to learn very quickly. So yeah, it's mind-blowing, and it continues to be mind-blowing. But I think in terms of digital maturity, you can see in research from Accenture and MIT that digitally mature teams are 26% more productive or have 9% more growth. But why? And I think it's because you're taking people on a journey. So you start with the awareness piece. So creating awareness of the technical parts, or the drivers of digital transformation. So why do we need to do it? The markets, the products, the processes, the systems, depending on which type of product you're looking at and where you're working, whether it's in an organization or a community or social enterprise. Which populations are we looking at? What are their drivers? What are our drivers? And then being aware what digital and what digital acceleration is going to bring to your current working practices and culture. Okay, so how is it going to change the way you do things around here? And that sounds simple, but it's complex because humans need to belong. And we don't like change. We don't like not being in control, for this, the scarf discussion around fight or flight. And, we're not necessarily consciously aware of our fears and our assumptions that are stopping us from making this transformation happen. What creates your resistance to change? And Robert Keegan, in his technical and adaptive challenges, talks about immunity to change. What is your individual immunity to change, i.e., what are you afraid of, and what assumptions do you have that are stopping you from taking that step forward? So creating the awareness is key on an individual and a collective level, but I think the move to understanding, so connecting with understanding, it sounds so Rome wasn't built in a day, but you can't start big on these type of things. I'm not saying you can't dream big, please do, because vision, collective visions and ambition, and you need that. However, you need to initiate new working practices, and small is beautiful for me where change is concerned. Piloting these ideas via proof of concept, allocating time and resources and supporting people to work differently and preparing the organization or the community or the project team for change, preparing them for what it means, allowing them to understand and connect with that understanding. And then moving on to how do you scale that impact? Okay, so how do you build this momentum through communities that work in a more of an agile way, through coaching and peer coaching? I'm not just talking about professional coaches, I'm also talking about accompanying your peers and in communities with coaching skills. So creating a space where they can express themselves, where they can be heard, and where they can actually have a healthy debate. And mentoring, learn from others. This is a lot of organizations don't look externally. They stay within their organizations. And this is what I love about social enterprise and communities, is that sharing happens, and it is so valuable. It's the basis of collective intelligence, is putting those diverse perspectives on a table. And I think there's a lot more mutual support in a community-based ecosystem. So, and it's the people that are ambassadors for furthering this systemic change, because people will go and get other people, and they will be hooked onto what you're doing by your experience and by belonging to your experience and understanding what it meant for you, and sort of demystifying, if you like, the risk and demystifying the uncertainty. So I'm a big believer in readiness and in understanding readiness, and that would almost be clearly high level roadmap. Where are we today? What do we need to change and why? And what are our fears and assumptions? Once I have that, what would we look to pilot differently to see if it works? What new ideas do we have? What would a proof of concept look like, and how would people work differently to do that? And then and this is the loop of, building something, measuring it, experiencing it, and learning. And then learning goes back into this whole loop of, and of course, within those loops, you have a higher degree of risk taking, and you have a higher degree of vulnerability. But without that, you won't get from this light bulb that you see, you won't get that light bulb to work because you'll be constantly just scared to put the last piece in. So it's a marathon, not a sprint, but you can train every day. That's what's great about it. And you learn every day, and it is about continuous learning. And it's about the culture you create. So we hear a lot about digital, clearly. Everyone has their own definition, as we discussed. We hear a lot about culture. So this is my definition of digital culture. When I say to you digital culture, this is what I mean. And we're going to touch on these 4 areas that we've already discussed: data and data-driven ways of working. Okay, so you cannot escape from data today. And why should you want to? It can bring you great insights that we didn't have before. But data-driven ways of working look very different. And they need a different decision-making process, and they need a different leadership. User-centric approach. So it reminds me of a HR project I did 15 years ago now, where we wanted to make HR more business-focused. And we didn't call it user centricity then, but we created a showroom and we took people in to show them what we were proposing in the different processes of HR and what it would change for them. And they came not because it looked great, which it did, and because it was colourful, which it was, but they came to understand what it meant for them and to have their questions answered. So if I look at a more design thinking approach, you're in that first bit of empathizing with the customer or the user or the employee and understanding their problems. What are their needs? What do they want? What are they afraid of? And for this, you need agility. So agility in processes, and so that you can work differently, but also emotional agility. The emotional agility to create ecosystems and networks. Okay, so to collaborate, to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to allow yourself to go and ask for help, and to create a collective momentum as opposed to just doing it on your own, which of course is faster and often is easier. But for me, you lose the potential and the value. You can see in the middle the value, because digital transformation is about creating value differently. And it's not just financial value, it's also human value. And if I look at my lean methodology, which I'm a big fan of lean, the 7 wastes of lean, they've added an 8th waste now, and it is untapped human potential. And I loved it when they added that, because this is what eco is about. It's about having enough emotional agility to allow a space and create the conditions where people will come and be vulnerable, but also give different perspectives. And finally, but clearly last but not least, skills. So you have the harder digital skills like cloud and robotics and AI and data. And then you have the softer digital skills, which are very different leadership skills and based on courage, curiosity, empathy. So these skills also need to be learned, but also need to be driven through the organization. Now, clearly, I'm not saying people don't have those skills. I'm just saying that in the leadership models today, they're not often put as a forefront, and they need to be. And you only realize that when you come up against conflict and siloed ways of working, because people do not know how to collaborate, even if they have, to come back to what I was saying, even if they have tools that help them collaborate, like Slack, like Trello, like Microsoft OneNote. There are so many and lots of applications that will allow you to collaborate digitally today. But what does that mean for the culture of the place you work and how you create that environment? So culture is key here in terms of creating sustainable change. Which brings me to Leonardo da Vinci. And I love this because for me, 2 things. One, it visualizes my big why. It visualizes the potential of social enterprise. It visualizes the potential of collective intelligence. But it also demystifies the process. And you can see on the left-hand side individual, and you can see on the right-hand side eco, but just look at how you can scale impact on the way. And my big learning here is that I would like to share with you is it's always about the system, and it's always worth looking at systems, even if it's quicker to do it on your own, on your piece of project, and you get it done and you can take it off your to-do list. I'm being very black and white, but that it's always about this. And you know, we've looked at change and change management. You need to go inside. You need to understand how your brain is wired and what that means for the way you react to change. And as I said, you know, changing culture and creating sustainable change is a marathon, and you have to train for it, and you can do it bit by bit. And I think small is beautiful. And as long as you have this, I'm going to call it a stained glass window picture, as long as you have your sort of stained glass window ambition, the collective outcome, the collective vision, then you can play with how you get from the single circle to the vision. But I feel very strongly about the fact that it has to be done, and my experience proves me right every time. It has to be done bit by bit. And I wanted to share with you some of the learnings for me of going from ideas to proof of concept. So we're back to the middle part of the readiness, understand, so connecting. How do you connect ideas to proof of concept? But while you're doing that, how do you create the momentum for more sustainable change? And the questions that we had to ask ourselves was, you know, have we done enough sense making? Okay, so the big why. Do people understand why we want to do it? And those people can be a team, they can be stakeholders, they can be customers. Do they know why we're doing this? Are the benefits clear? Have we taken people on a journey? So the great thing about doing it in small chunks is that, and measurable chunks, is that you can get tangible results, and that always onboards people because it creates safety. Do we know what this idea, this proof of concept, is going to change in our ways of working, in what we're doing? We're back to, will I have autonomy? Can I control this? Do I know what it means for me? I might not like it, but if I know what it means for me, then I can think about it differently. I can think about, you know, what it will mean for my decision-making process, what it means for my operating model. And finally, for scaling, do we have the right capabilities and skills to scale this idea across whatever? Across the organization, if it's an organization, across my business ecosystem, if I'm an entrepreneur and I work with an ecosystem of people, a network of people, across my department, across my country. So it depends, but so I'm giving lots of different alternatives for the system part, but you can see that the idea and the how doesn't change. Okay, the questions you need to ask yourself don't change. And what's on this slide is 5 or 10 years of going back to the drawing board, iterating, understanding what we did or didn't do, understanding what worked, what didn't work, getting more diverse perspectives, trying new things. And a proof of concept doesn't have to be an application or a product or a service. You can also prototype and test ideas such as new team rituals, new ways of working, trying to create change roadmaps. You know, you can proof of concept anything. And for me, what is important is the understanding of the human process that goes behind it. So it's about human systems. And my definition of human systems is that intricate web of skills, relationships, partnerships, and interactions that are needed. And you can see the 3 areas around the model. Managing the system. Okay, what does my system look like? What is my role in the system? How do I interact and manage my system? Manage myself and also my interactions. How do I create systemic leadership? Okay, so how do I create an environment that's psychologically safe, where people will come and speak to me, where we can be curious, but we can also challenge each other healthily, and that I can also lead across boundaries, whatever those boundaries look like. I don't have to be in my territory with my ego. I can lead differently in more of a servant leadership style across boundaries. And becoming a systems catalyst, I've called it. So how do I collaborate, and how do I take people with me, and how do I get people excited about this journey, essentially? When I work in organizations, and now even in the orchestra, and I'm parts of lots of associations, it's all about getting people excited about your vision and taking them with you. And I generally do that because I am excited about what the collective can bring, and I don't think we use it enough. So I won't read through all of these, but I also wanted to share with you lessons learned to make it more tangible of what I've learned from managing human systems to date. You know, it is about understanding yourself. It is about going inside. It is about understanding your system and your role in there. It is about understanding interactions. And small is beautiful. You can't start big, or you can, but it may not create sustainable change. Building communities of like-minded people, brilliant. And also my definition of inclusion. So surrounding yourself with people who are as different as possible from you, to try and get as many different perspectives as possible, because you need to learn every day, and you can't just tick a box and say, I've done that change project, or oh no, I know what that means. And that's what I love about what I do, is that I'm constantly challenged, and I need that. And I think the collective needs that to build momentum. Always measure what you do so that you have some understanding, but also some credibility in terms of what has and hasn't worked. And then deliberately use the informal power dynamics as a lever. So when we looked at the Leadership University, and I set up the Leadership University, we changed the hypothesis. And the hypothesis was that leadership equals impact. And that means that everybody is a leader. And I wholly believe that that's the way forward. It's not about status in an organization. It's not about how big your office is. It's not about where you sit in an institution. For me, it's about how you engage people on this collective journey, and how you take them where they want to go. So it's essentially thought leadership. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to finish with the three shifts that you need to understand to bridge the gap between digital and human. The shift from I to we, the learn, unlearn, relearn. You can see it's about data and humans all the time. So you're constantly balancing data and skills, mindset, and culture. And it is a balancing act. And COVID, we hear a lot about the new normal. For me, it's about the new balance between data and skills, the new balance between I and we, and the new balance between what I'm calling the human reaction to change, what I feel inside, and how I interact externally. I would just like to leave you with my favorite African proverb. I've mentioned it various times, but it is faster to go alone. But if you want to go further, go together. It's more inclusive, it's more collaborative, and the most important thing for me is it's more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzie. Thank you for that. That's great. I think we've had a couple of comments to say you might actually be describing cooperatives there when you're talking about all the values and together and collaboration. So, brilliant presentation, and yeah, thank you for that. Yep. That was as excellent. And Karen, I don't know if you have some feedback there.
Well, I know we're short of time, and I'm sure people want to do a bit of networking. But honestly, Suzie, that was just fantastic. I'm scribbling away in old school style with a pen and mind maps and things. And I think we're going to be able to get a copy of your presentation. Quite a few people have been asking.
Absolutely,
I think,
more than happy.
I just think there's so much to talk about, and it would be good for people to network. But just one thing I really wanted to just throw out, and maybe for people to think about in their groups as well. You talked a lot about humans and the importance of change and taking people with you. But I guess one of the things I think is quite challenging, and particularly for people in smaller organisations, social enterprises, community sector, health boards, local authorities, etc., is that the term digital transformation scares people, it puts people off. It's been bandied around for a long time. I still don't understand what it means. It means different things to different people. So I guess the question is it time for a new language and a new way of thinking about this and framing it? Because actually, digital is a part of a process. So I'm just throwing that out there as a thought, as you know, because I do think we get completely bogged down with terminology, and you can see a lot of people just turning off at that particular term. I don't expect an answer. I'm just throwing that out there for maybe for people to have a think about.
But I think it's a great question, and the question I would add on to that for them to think about is what works for you.